Between the 1999 demo and everything that will be expanded with the Tekrot Encore update, I think us players have had far more access to Hollvania in 1999 than any of us were expecting. In particular, I have seen my fellow Tenno talk feverishly about how the gameplay still feels like Warframe, how the setting is changing their perceptions of the gameplay, and how this update is going to bring on a whole new Warframe 2.0. Quite honestly, whether it's the same old game we've always loved, a brand new experience, or somewhere in between, I am happy. Because as always, when I play Warframe, my focus is on appreciating the story, the art, and the inspiration the game has taken to deliver these experiences to us. While playing the 1999 demo, I was predicting a very different kind of Hollvania. I'm glad I didn't call my shot in public on this one. I thought that DE was pulling the wool over our eyes, and we're going to reveal that Hollvania was another free roam map, predictable landmarks and locations to visit. Instead, we received an inspired tile set that changes with the season of an in-game calendar, systems upon systems for roleplay, and an even more expansive map tile set when Tekrot Encore drops. In the 1999 demo, I saw a lot of people zip through the city on their Atomi cycles, showing off that they still have Excalibur mastered, even without playing as him for years. I've done that myself a couple times for sure. I have also seen people talk about accidentally defaulting to cover shooter gameplay just due to the aesthetic presentation of playing as a person with a face. However, I think that there is something more here. Something we can learn about Warframe, now that the setting is so much closer to our personal experiences. I was 7 years old in 1999. At the turn of the millennium, I was drinking carbonated grape juice alongside my parents and my brother, glad that my mother already threw her yearly holiday party for her employees earlier in the month, and I wasn't sequestered to the basement with my Game Boy in the basement rec room. Hollvania's New Year's Eve is going so much worse than mine did, but that doesn't mean we can't appreciate the party they were throwing with a little bit of urban exploration. This video is inspired by a YouTuber called Any Austin, who makes these deep and surprisingly interesting videos on the ecology, city planning, and world building of different video games. I know for a fact that the city of Hollvania has a lot to offer, and I'd like your help to uncover the city's secrets, the many mysteries lying just around a corner or tucked in an alleyway. Now, I am hard at work making my lore videos. I want to go as deep as possible on Warframe 1999 and really take my time with it. It seems to me that DE is going to be expanding on Hollvania for some time yet, meaning my 1999 video is going to have to be massive, even more so than my Duviri video. In the meantime, we're going to explore Hollvania's back alleys, side streets, nooks, and crannies, starting with the tile set of the 1999 demo. If you would like to help me in this endeavor, you can find me on Blue Sky at SocraTetris and by using the hashtag 99expo, which I will be checking periodically. Help me find things that I have missed. Help me highlight features of architecture and culture from Eastern Europe that I'm probably not going to be able to catch on my own. I will be crediting people who help me find new discoveries to highlight in this series. So, without further ado, let's slow the hell down for a moment as you join me for a relaxing midnight stroll through Hollvania. So we're starting off here just watching Arthur, myself, going through and looking at as many things in the level as we possibly can. Stopped at this terminal in the first place, mainly just to look at the computer and at the oddly lotus-shaped head to the infested strain here. Very similar to the top head of our Helminth chair in the Orbiter and in the back room of Hollvania, of the Hollvania shopping mall. Looking around, we're seeing a lot of advertisements, a lot of posters for various things in the setting. The ones that we're seeing on the sort of standees next to the buses were posters for signing up for internet connection. And I just focused on it for a second, but there was also a short moment that we spent looking at surveillance cameras that are being placed externally, that they are on the outside of the city facing public streets, which sort of cues us into the kind of culture that we're dealing with the Hollvanian government in that it appears as though public surveillance is very important to them. If you take the time to look, I think most tile sets have security cameras placed on random public buildings, facing and trying to get a full landscape of public roads. Of course, there's going to be a lot of online posters, and if you let it fool you for a second, if you don't pay too much of attention, you might come to expect that all of the advertisements are actually advertisements for online. And I would say a good deal of them are, but definitely not all. Now, unfortunately, I'm not able to read or translate Orokin script, so a lot of the signs are going to be things that I'm not able to translate for you or identify in detail. We, of course, can use symbology, semiotics, to understand a little bit more about what's going on. We see the green cross is obviously some sort of hospital or clinic. There are signs for coffee shops that are placed about, but things on the walls that may be anywhere from an advertisement, an eviction notice, a city ordinance. Things like that are things I probably wouldn't be able to identify due to a lack of being able to translate the text myself. We'll also notice that a lot of streamers, decorative flags, and national flags for the state of Hollvania are strung up around the different buildings, across streetways, across windows and doorways. And of course, I think that can be chalked up to the fact that we are looking at a city that was moments before a New Year's celebration. I'm not sure the timeline exactly lines up with that, though, because we were looking at the onset of the tech rot problem being prior to the 1999 celebration, significantly prior to it. So it makes me think that rather than these decorations being for New Year's Eve, that these decorations are mainly for something like a national holiday that must have happened earlier in the year, before the state decided to initiate its complete lockdown. Now, I'm taking a moment to stop and review a lot of these little shops here. I find it very cute and very quaint that we have these wooded patios for outdoor seating for various cafes and shops that are around. I'm not sure how common it would be for that sort of setup in Eastern European cafes to prioritize outdoor seating like that. We're also taking some time to explore this fixture that we see pretty much at the start of every 1999 mission. This orb that is being placed in the center of a pool of water. It's not really a fountain because the water isn't moving, so I find it curious. I also wanted to stop and look at this mural, but it's a mural that is kind of hard to see with the nighttime tile set, especially with the shadow going across it. I think it is interesting that we are looking at the depiction of what might be a graffiti artist, but it could also be a rendition of Skuldra. It doesn't have the trademark uniform depictions of Skuldra, and so I'm leaning towards graffiti artist. But that's definitely going to be something that I want to focus on throughout the course of this video, because if you take the time to look, Hollvania actually has a lot of interesting graffiti. So this would be one of the first graffitis that we see. It's clearly a depiction of Kalimos, with very jagged, very sharp and high contrast lettering. But if we walk over here and see the different graffiti on the wall crossing over all of these posters, we're seeing different styles of graffiti, and not only different styles, but graffiti being sprayed on top of and over other graffiti that's already been done. And that's something that games that try to use graffiti as a decoration for a city often don't get correct, is that graffiti is layered, that the graffiti is something like a competitive art form amongst a culture, that when you go through and you see these graffitis, you're going to see different artists, different claims of being the artist, cover-ups, additions, different signatures trying to claim more prominence over a piece of art. And I find that very interesting because WARFRAME is taking the time to demonstrate that aspect of graffiti culture, how it actually would naturally develop when you're placed in an actual city. Something that we glossed over a little bit as we were talking about the graffiti there for just a moment. Oh, before that, this is a very interesting spot because I find this to be a very makeshift kind of living room. This feels like an apartment complex style situation. I took a long time to stop and look at the commercial here, but the fact that we're having a couch that is outdoors, hooked up to a TV, and watching under this little outcropping, I don't know, there's something that feels very, I guess, downtown urban center about that. Not the modern kind of downtown where it's supposed to be a center of commerce, but an older sense of downtown where it would be a central location for a lot of lower income people to live after the large, of course I'm thinking from a United States worldview and less so a European worldview. But there was a mass exodus from urban centers after the 20s that turned downtown areas into lower income areas. And thus you would see sort of makeshift living accommodations developed out of that circumstance. But what I was trying to say before, and I keep missing my opportunity to talk about it, is the posters that we're looking at when we are exploring the walls here in 1999. I find that the posters seem to be acting as a bit of a contrast against the graffiti, because the posters that we're looking at are mainly in the service of propaganda for the state. So we're looking at posters that advertise the Skuldra. We're looking at posters that are sort of promoting their aesthetic, their military might. There's a few different posters that are like music posters or acts for creative entertainment sort of things. But most of the posters are definitely focused around creating propaganda for the state. And I think none of the posters demonstrate that more so than the ones for Albrecht and Trotti himself, because they not only present military might, but they present a sort of religious zeal. Albrecht was absolutely presenting himself not just as a doctor, but as something of a cult or religious figure. And that is something that we were aware of from the Codex before, but seeing himself present himself in a Christ-like depiction, with his arms stretched out in a cross, with light shining behind him, there was definitely a mass intentionality on his part to not just use the aesthetics of, or to not just try to be a religious symbol while trying to spread his cure to the Tekrot, which he himself introduced, but to also use the imagery and the authority of the state in order to accomplish that task. You'll see that Albrecht and the Skaldra's propaganda posters heavily feature a bright neon yellow, and I definitely think that is an intentional point of the art that we're looking at. Yeah, there is so much graffiti, and so much varied graffiti, everything from art to just pure text. And if anyone has started the great work of translating all of these graffitis, identifying different styles, I would definitely want someone to link that resource to me. I haven't been able to find it myself yet. Now, this is something that I'm absolutely interested in. This little internal area that has been modeled on the inside of the wall of this one apartment. I don't know if you can get as good a look in there as I did watching the video, but I believe that little nook was a listening room. Now, I believe that because basically it was just a door, a very small, narrow room, a stand, and a chair, and it appeared to me that that end table was the kind of end table that you would place something like a vinyl record player on, or a radio, a stand for a radio. And so I think that little room that I ran into was actually what's called a listening room. It's not really something that's popular or a part of housing nowadays, but back when the average home transitioned from listening to radio in their living rooms to watching television in their living rooms, people didn't just get rid of their radios, and a lot of people actually made dedicated listening spaces to the radio. Here in Florida, there was a thing called the Florida Room, which would be lowered, separated parts of the house that would normally become the listening room. There were a lot of people who, of course, transitioned their porches or their front or back porches to become the space for listening to the radio. And eventually that fell out of favor as audio platforms became as available and convenient as everything else through the eventual adoption of the smartphone. But I found it interesting that someone took the time to create a small listening room on one corner of this street in Hollvania. I think one of the things that stands out most in the different tile sets of the top of Hollvania is what appears to be this state building, or perhaps it is a museum of some kind. In the preview, the prequel manga, or the prequel webcomic for WARFRAME 1999, we do see them have to take on a mission in a museum sort of setting, a mission that doesn't go very well, and I think that that building may in fact be the building from the comic. It's hard for me to conclude that it is in fact a state building because it doesn't seem to be particularly guarded or set up as a place of operation, so at this current moment I lean closer to thinking that this is a old museum or some old building of state that used to be very significant to Hollvania's culture, but has perhaps fallen by the wayside, become something that isn't quite as modern or as important. I find this fixture to also be very interesting. This extremely large techno optimist style, I guess, media center in a public park. It's hard to say what that thing's purpose really is, considering its bulk. We're taking a moment and looking in this corner here at vending machines and at these posters. And when I first saw these posters in the subway during the Whispers in the Wall quest, of course I thought these were movie posters, but you'll happen to notice that all the movie posters seem to have a sort of military-inspired theme, which leans me more towards seeing that the art in Hollvania is geared towards supporting what is very clearly a very militaristic society. Here's another mural that I found interesting. Definitely would be interested in finding the real-world artist that was responsible for this. It appears to be something related to the soul religion that we learn about when speaking to the Hex in the dating sim functions of the 1999 update. A woman in red clothing with the sun draped behind her head, wielding a sword. It makes me wonder if that character is a representation or a humanoid representation, anthropomorphized representation of the soul deity that is the unique sun-worshipping religion of Hollvania that may in fact be tied to the bright yellow, bright orange-yellow imagery of both the Skaldra and Albrecht and Trotti's propaganda posters. I found this little area very quaint. It's very tightly packed housing, but with a little central courtyard, a little bit of trash left on the side, and a large tree growing out of the center of it. It reminds me that the architecture here in Hollvania is definitely Eastern European architecture. Something like that would very easily be flattened and squared off in the United States if everything was meant to be terraformed and put on planned grids during the Western expansionism phase of American history. And so these sort of naturalistic attempts to create buildings, streets, and preserve natural landmarks as you are developing your housing are something that are a bit less common in the United States. Not that it never happens, but I grew up in the Midwest where everything was flat and rectangular as far as the eye could see. And it was definitely intentionally that way. Here I'm starting to try to take a look at the Skybox and the different features that are a bit further off in Hollvania, as I'm not very versed in Eastern European architecture to be able to talk about the buildings, but we're clearly in a very technologically advanced society, that matches with modern day capabilities because they have these large megastructures in the distance. They have what appears to be a very large stadium, a large spire, which may be some sort of commerce center. We're not sure because we haven't been able to get close to any of those landmarks with any of the existing tile sets. I would say this gray poster of a woman standing alone on the street is one of the few movie posters in the game that actually represents something that isn't military themed. Something else of note that I haven't given very much space to with my other commentary is that there definitely appears to, or the streets of Hollvania have been obviously quartered off by these large inflatable tents. So a lot of the streets are still open and available, but it definitely appears as though the quarantine that was established for the city because of the tech rot outbreak is something that was set up very quickly with a sort of, not so much a nuclear option, but a stopgap measure that could be deployed very quickly. They didn't construct a wall or anything like that. They just had this system for creating fumigation tents and essentially adapted it for a large-scale enclosing of the city itself. And because we're in an Eastern European context, I can't help but think, to a certain extent, of the Berlin Wall and the attempt to quarter off up one portion or two different halves of a city due to the different political influences of the time, trying to maintain political control and influence over other cultures to ensure their own system of government being continued in that area after the end of World War II there and the collapse of the fascist regime of Nazi Germany. We also passed out of a small nook a moment ago that showed a series of apartment doors that had, when one of the doors had a very clear eviction notice on it. I also wanted to take a stop and look at those two terminals because one of them was a quaint old newspaper dispensing box where you drop a quarter in like a gotcha pawn machine, be able to open the cabinet and grab a newspaper out. Those little machines were a staple of my weekly life whenever my family would go to church on Sundays and usually head out to a village inn, a breakfast restaurant that had the local and national newspapers in those boxes available for sale for just a quarter still, even as the years went on. It's a quaint little part of my memory that I wanted to make mention of here. I think it's probably been at least probably 10 years since I've seen a newspaper box in public. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but that stage there felt a little bit more makeshift to me, like it was something that was erected specifically for the celebration, whatever celebration Hollvania happened to be in the middle of before the quarantine began. But it is built around a tree that's existing in this plaza, so perhaps it is a bit more of a steady feature of the city, of this particular square. We seem to have a little bit of a miniature mall food court, but it's also open air and facing the city square that we were looking at before. And this structure very much confuses me. Perhaps Eastern European viewers could give me a little bit of insight onto that as to what possible context could there be for a mall food court to also be in an outdoor strip mall setting, or if you have seen anything like that in your own cities at home. I personally happen to have a little bit of a romantic attachment to food courts, and especially strip mall food courts, because of how much time I spent in them as a teenager growing up. Now we're getting a really good look at the Skybox here, noticing that one section of the city is some sort of an amusement park that has an absolutely massive Ferris wheel. And we're getting a couple better looks at these towers that we were looking at a little bit earlier, being able to see more of them, one of them clearly being some sort of radio tower and the other being a full building structure that one could potentially go and visit in the future. As we're coming to the ending sections here, something that I found very quaint was this sort of outdoor theater that had been set up by linking up a bunch of televisions and placing a bunch of benches. It's another sort of social feature that I haven't seen, but this is definitely an outdoor theater. It's a walk-in theater because these benches also appear to be fitted with speakers, and there are these devices to be able to change programming, perhaps at a premium. Currently playing the latest advertisements for Online's newest album on loop. But the fact that this was set up not just anywhere, but in the middle of an apartment complex square makes me wonder if this wasn't a city-funded or a public space, like a public park, but something that the people of these apartment complex actually agreed to and coordinated in developing and setting up. Because the placement for this definitely is a little suspicious, a little curious. One would assume that this was perhaps a public good, but its location makes it sort of inhospitable to the people living around those apartments, unless they very much wanted to invest in and create that sort of public entertainment area to compensate for perhaps them being in a lower income area. They perhaps pooled their resources together to create something particularly special to their own building and their own personal community. I do take some time to continue watching the different commercials. Of course, at the time, I couldn't have known that we would have all these commercials available to us. I think it's funny that the online posters in this area have been graffitied or vandalized so that you cannot see the faces of any of Online's membership. But I was definitely very fascinated about that late 90s, early 2000s bubble UI that was being implemented and is being demonstrated in all of these advertisements for internet connection and to get set up with various computers and cell phones. It seems like Hollvania was having a huge push to adopt different technologies, more so than probably the rest of the country, considering the size of the apartment buildings, of all the structures, giving it the feeling of the downtown portion of an extremely built and extremely populated, but also extremely old and storied city. This television was of particular interest because it is very clearly showing footage of some sort of New Year's Eve celebration. I don't know if that is actual live footage from, say, like a New York Times Square ball drop, but it definitely was the compressed or at least it appeared to be the compressed footage of actual live action video showing a fireworks or a rocket display of some kind. Don't mind the car that's on fire. I did that earlier, and it's still on fire. Cars can burn for a long time in Hollvania, apparently. If I were more proficient at this, I would have also taken a little bit more of the time to try to identify and commentate on the different kinds of songs that we were hearing in the different corners. We definitely heard a little bit of a more folksy tune that was playing. But the vast majority of everything that we're looking at is going to be online-centric, or everything that we're hearing in terms of any music that isn't a commercial or isn't an online soundtrack is definitely harder to pin, definitely harder to pull out. And I haven't explored the different audio tracks that have been made available to us, but I don't think anything has been as folksy as the thing we just observed a moment ago. And apparently I didn't finish off all the sculpture that had been populated in the demo. So I guess we're going to just do a little bit of finishing them off before we wrap up here. But anyways, that is the entire Warframe 1999 demo. I tried to get to as many of the different cultural or interesting points as I could, and as a result of choosing that sort of method, I didn't really have the time to deep dive onto any of these points. But I want you to let me know in the comments what you think of this new series, of this new potential format, of things that we could explore while trying to break down and understand the art direction and the world building that's happening in the Warframe 1999 setting of Hollvania. If you enjoyed this series, please be sure to let me know. If you have ideas for what else that we can explore, I'd love to hear them. If you like this idea and want to see more, also make sure to put a like on the video and subscribe to the channel. I can definitely see if you are subscribing using this video as opposed to the others, and that can help me know, help me gauge the interest that we have. Thank you for giving your time to this. Thank you so much for stopping by to the channel while we are on hiatus between lore videos. And of course, I will see you next time. Stay true.